fellow Nigerians, the events of the past month, starting from the annulment of the June 12 presidential election, culminating in the appointment of the former head of state, Chief Shonekan, are well known to you.
What message do you have, as a last question, to your teeming supporters across the country?
That there is plenty of hope, that there's no doubt at all that the president and the military government will leave office on the 27th of August. And there might be need to meet and discuss some details. And I'm always ready and willing to discuss details. This is not a civilian versus military situation. A preponderant majority of the Nigerian military and their family voted overwhelmingly for me in the last election.
On June 23, 1993, Babangida shockingly annulled the presidential election results and declined to cede power to Abiola. The annulment engulfed Nigeria in its worst political crisis since the Civil War, and its consequences hung like a curse over Nigeria for the next 5 years. Yorubas interpreted the annulment as a deliberate act by the northern-led military government to prevent a southerner from becoming president. A storm of protests, riots, and strikes rocked Nigeria, especially in Lagos. Angry youths set up the obligatory burning barricades and hurled rocks at the police. They robbed and stoned or waved at passing cars, depending on their assessment of the political affiliation of the car's occupants. The intensity of the protests frightened markets, shops, banks, and businesses into closing. In the absence of their proprietors, looters broke in and had a field day stealing items such as cookers, fridges, and televisions, and carted them away in wheelbarrows and trolleys and on their heads. Fearing that pogroms would soon follow, thousands of the Igbo ethnic group fled from northern and southwestern Nigeria back to their homeland in the southeast. The circumstances of their annulment were opaque. It stunned not only the public, but also senior members of the government. Even the Vice President, Admiral Augustus Aikomu, was caught off guard. When Aikomu learned of the annulment, he phoned a senior security officer to exclaim, "What the hell is happening?" Even former military head of state condemned the annulment. General Obasanjo held a forum at his farm in Ota, which was attended by another former military head of state, Major General Muhammadu Buhari, who said, "The military institution we know best has been desecrated, infiltrated, and perverted. Our colleagues are messing up the country and nobody can deny it." In late July, the National Defense and Security Council, NDSC, held a marathon meeting to debate the annulment and find a way out of the crisis. The meeting degenerated into a shouting match. Despite several days of discussions and hard bargaining, the key military stakeholders would not budge. They refused to accept Abiola as their president. Babangida said that NDSC members never saw him as somebody who is morally upright or fit, and they didn't feel comfortable that this would be their commander-in-chief. Whether the annulment was Babangida's personal decision or something forced on him by other officers, he took the blame for it. Babangida had come to office 8 years earlier with a reputation as an enlightened and benevolent dictator. His bonhomie and charisma were legendary. A government official who worked for Babangida was almost eulogistic in his praise of his personal qualities. All who have come in close contact with him acknowledge his disarming charm, his geniality, and his warm friendliness. In him we see a man agreeable, debonair, and warm-hearted, a man modest in demeanor and humble in spirits, with a most winning smile and a most affable manner. In the public perception, the annulment transformed Babangida from Nigeria's most enlightened military dictator into its most revealed. The tumultuous wave of protests and anti-military hostility placed severe pressure on Babangida to resign. Yet there was no word from him on whether he would keep his promise to leave power on August 27th. Abiola too was feeling the pressure. After senior military officers advised him not to sleep at home and rumors spread that his life was in danger, Abiola flew to London on August 3rd. Although he said he traveled abroad to drum up international support and put pressure on the military, his journey bore the appearance of an escape. Traveling abroad when civil agitation against the military was at its most intense took the steam out of the struggle. It also played into the hands of civilian and military skeptics who doubted whether Abiola had the fortitude to be president. No one knew whether Babangida would stay or go until he addressed the National Assembly on his birthday on August 17th. Babangida offered as my personal sacrifice to voluntarily step aside as the president and commander-in-chief. He had decided to jump rather than be pushed. However, he still refused to cede power to Abiola. He would instead hand over power to a civilian-led Interim National Government (ING) on August 27th. However, he made no announcement about who would lead the ING or about its other members or composition. Even the legal officers tasked with drafting the enabling legislation for the ING had no idea for whom they were drafting the governing instruments. Attorney General Clement Akpambu, Professor Ben Nwabezi, retired Supreme Court Judge Paul Nwokedi, Professor Ovagiri, and the constitutional lawyer Dr. Efifani Azingi of the University of Benin got on with their task despite being in the dark. The legal officers drafted the ING's enabling legislation over 5 consecutive days without knowing for whom it would be promulgated. When they completed the text of the draft decree, they left a blank space for the name of the ING's leader to be inserted. The military asked former Head of State General Obasanjo to lead the ING, but he declined. Yet Babangida continued with his business as usual. He held the farewell military parade with his service chiefs on August 27th. With only moments left before the end of his nearly 8-year reign, the entire nation was still in the dark about who would succeed him. Immediately after the farewell parade, Babangida returned to the council chambers inside the presidential villa to oversee the swearing-in ceremony of his successor. At 3 p.m. on August 26th, government officials swarmed into the council chambers, which was filled to capacity. Although they knew they were about to witness the swearing-in of the next head of state, most of the people inside the chambers had no idea who that person would be. Suddenly, the 57-year-old head of the Transitional Council, Ernest Shonekan, was called forward to be sworn in as head of the ING by Chief Justice Mohammed Bello.
It is with a deep sense of responsibility that once again I accept the challenge to serve as the head of the Interim National Government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Today's historic event testifies eloquently to our enduring capacity as a nation to fashion out our solutions to problems arising from our peculiar circumstances. Thus, that we are innovating with the interim government, following closely on the heels of the Transitional Council, should reassure us all of our ability to bounce back, even when it appears we are moving dangerously close to the brink. The task, ladies and gentlemen, before the interim national government is enormous. Primarily, we must successfully complete the political transition program, which has been in progress since the inception of the Babangida administration.
Shonekan swore in the other members of the ING on the following day. Shonekan was like Abiola, an Egba Yoruba man from Abeokuta. He was a graduate of the Church Missionary Society Grammar School in Lagos, Nigeria's oldest secondary school. He had a degree in law from the University of London and was also a graduate of Harvard Business School. Shonekan had a distinguished corporate career as a businessman and joined the legal department of the United Africa Company UAC, which still exists today as Unilever. He rose to become UAC's deputy legal advisor and later its chief executive. He headed the company at a time when it was the largest African-owned business in sub-Saharan Africa. After his successful business career, he entered politics in January 1993 when Babangida dissolved the federal cabinet and replaced it with a 31-member transitional council, which included only 2 military officers. Babangida appointed Shonekan to head the transitional council, which was to oversee the transition from military to civilian rule. One of Shonekan's colleagues on the council described him as a simple, modest, unostentatious man of no exceptional ability, yet one who always keeps his head as he weaves his way unobtrusively while shrewdly to his set objectives in life. He is, by any standard, a solid personality. Shortly after Shonekan's swearing-in ceremony, Babangida moved out of the presidential villa and departed in a convoy with his family and belongings for his hilltop mansion in his hometown of Minna in Niger State. He left without a farewell address to the military. It was a muted exit, a departure from the majestic and ostentatious ceremonies that usually accompanied Babangida's public appearances. The ING era is often treated as a mere punctuation mark in Nigeria's history. Glossing over the ING obscures key events that influenced subsequent controversies. Babangida's forced exit from power was a watershed. It was the first time in Nigeria's history that a military government had ceded power involuntarily by means other than a coup. For the first time since the commencement of military rule 27 years earlier, Nigerians challenged the military with mass civil disobedience and protests and pressured the military into making concessions. Although the pro-democracy movement failed to achieve immediately its short-term goal of an Abiola presidency, the military's hurried replacement by civilian government demonstrated that there was limits to the military's power and that civilians were not without influence. The emergence of the unwieldy ING was testimony to Babangida's ingenious ability to maneuver his way out of one crisis after another with his head still attached to his body. It also once again demonstrated the extraordinary ability of the Nigerian state to absorb crisis and the propensity of its elite to take the country to the edge of a cliff before pulling it back at the last possible moment. The ING was a middle ground between the demands of the military and the pro-democracy opposition. It allowed the opposition to claim it had pushed the military out of power while also giving the military a face-saving way out of power without acceding to the demands of an Abiola presidency. The ING was to govern for only 6 months, during which time it was supposed to organize new elections. However, Shonekan received a baptism of fire. One day after he was sworn in, oil workers walked off their installations and air traffic and airport staff also went on strike. The strikes grounded flights and left thousands of passengers stranded around the country. The Murtala Mohammed Airport in Lagos managed to stay open only with skeleton staff and drafted in air traffic controllers from the Air Force on an emergency basis. The Nigerian Labour Congress and the National Union of Petroleum and National Gas Workers also went on strike to protest against the establishment of the ING. The Campaign for Democracy called a 3-day stay-at-home protest that shut down most of southwestern Nigeria. The strikes and protests paralyzed commercial activity in Lagos as shops, businesses, and markets closed. Another grievance was the announcement on August 22nd that the government planned to introduce a new, expensive, high-grade fuel. This measure was widely believed to be the first move towards removing the government subsidies which made Nigerian domestic petrol among the cheapest in the world. Fuel shortages caused lengthy queues and delays. Shonekan inherited the animosity that had been directed at Babangida. Although the latter was no longer the head of state, the public and politicians viewed the ING as a puppet continuation of Babangida's government rather than its replacement. Abiola's running mate, Babagana Kingibe, said that leaving Shonekan in charge is like the military putting on a glove. Shonekan was a skilled and experienced executive with a successful corporate career. However, the cutthroat world of Nigerian politics was to be his greatest challenge. He correctly identified as a top priority the need to achieve rapprochement with those aggrieved over the June 12 election annulment. He conducted many consultations with political stakeholders and traditional leaders around the country, including visits to Benue, Edo, Kano, and Sokoto states. He then sought to broaden his political base by pardoning exiled Nigerian politicians such as Richard Akinjide and Adisa Akinloye, who had been fugitives abroad since the military returned to power in 1984 and declared its intention to arrest them. He freed some journalists who had been arrested and detained by Babangida's government and promised to ask the National Assembly to repeal the repressive military decrees that restricted civilian and press freedom. To address the lingering June 12 controversy, he also established an 8-member panel of inquiry led by Justice Maman Nasir, a former Federal Court of Appeal judge, to investigate the annulment of the June 12 election. He launched a media campaign that promoted the ING as a civilian government of national reconciliation and announced that public enterprise such as the National Ports Authority, the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, and the Nigerian Postal Service will be investigated for corruption. 7 senior NNPC officials were arrested on corruption charges. However, while Shonekan got down to business, the military also got down to theirs as if he did not exist. Although Decree 61 appointed Shonekan as the titular commander-in-chief of the armed forces, strangely, Chief Justice Bello omitted Shonekan's designation as commander-in-chief when he swore him in as the head of the ING. This was symptomatic of the military's indifference to Shonekan. Just before leaving power, Babangida had made a minor alteration that went unnoticed by most members of the public. A few days before Shonekan's inauguration, Babangida amended the decree that created the ING by inserting a section that Professor Ben Nwabezi described as curious but pregnant. Nwabezi insisted that this new section was not in the final draft that he and his colleagues had submitted to Babangida, and that it was mysteriously inserted after he had finalized the decree's text. The new section stipulated that if Shonekan's office became vacant by reason of his death or resignation, he would be replaced by the most senior minister. However, the decree did not identify this most senior minister. Only a few people noticed this strange amendment. The day before Babangida resigned, on August 25th, he met with the military service chiefs and dropped one of his characteristic bombshells. He announced that he would retire from the military and would take all of them with him into retirement. However, Babangida omitted the Minister of Defense from the retirement list. Babangida claimed that this minister was exempted because the ING needed protection from being overthrown by radical and unpredictable junior officers. As Babangida put it, "I thought the Interim National Government needed a very, very strong muscle so as to punch effectively. That strong muscle was General Sani Abacha." On November 17, 1993, ING members arrived for a meeting with Shonekan at the presidential villa. However, they were kept waiting as Shonekan had to meet other unscheduled visitors. Abacha, Dia, and Aliyu Mohammed Gusau had arrived and requested an urgent meeting with Shonekan. They did not come alone, but arrived with heavily armed troops. An observer present at the villa described the armed detachment of soldiers accompanying the 3 generals as simply one of the most intimidating I had ever witnessed. Colonel Lawan Gwadabe, the former commander of the National Guard, was also present. Abacha, Dia, and Gusau met with Shonekan in his office, in the company of the secretary to the ING, Alhaji Mustafa Umara. Shonekan may have been reassured by the presence of his good friend Gusau, who had been his squash partner for many years. Senior military officers had frequently held briefings with Shonekan in the past. However, this time the mood was very different. Abacha gave Shonekan an unflattering appraisal of the political situation. One publication claimed that he described Shonekan's government as weak, purposeless, and directionless. To add spice, the officers also informed Shonekan of the alleged plan by a group of radical junior officers to stage a bloody coup and execute several prominent Nigerians. Of course, there was no way of verifying this. After concluding this dire summary of the political situation, Abacha asked Shonekan if he was willing to resign. The officers did not take Shonekan's cooperation for granted. They had made contingency plans to deploy armored tanks in Lagos and Abuja if he refused to go. One of the officers would then make a nationwide broadcast announcing the military's reassumption of power. After the meeting concluded, Shonekan called his secretaries to his office at approximately 8 p.m. and briefed them. At 8:45 p.m., Shonekan's chief press secretary summoned the Nigerian Television Authority's State House reporter, Mohammed Kudu Abubakar, to record a speech by Shonekan. At 11 p.m., the NTA broadcast footage of Shonekan meeting with other members of the ING and reading a speech to announce his resignation. News of Shonekan's resignation had been broadcast on Radio Nigeria shortly before at 10:30 p.m. Before its airing on the NTA, the announcement did not mention who would replace Shonekan. After he recorded his speech, the senior officers offered Shonekan a lift, but he declined, choosing instead to depart from Abuja and head south for Lagos late at night by road. He arrived in Lagos around 3 a.m. It is not clear whether Shonekan voluntarily resigned, whether he was coerced into resigning, or whether what happened on the evening of November 17 was a military coup. A parallel can be drawn between the events of November 17, 1993 and January 16, 1966, after Nigeria's first military coup. On that Sunday evening in 1966, the GOC of the Nigerian Army, Major General Aguiyi-Ironsi, arrived at the Cabinet Office to meet the civilian political leadership as part of a 3-man security troika with the head of the Navy, Commodore Joseph Way, and the Acting Inspector General of Police, Alhaji Kam Salem. Like Abacha 27 years later, Aguiyi-Ironsi was also accompanied by several other intimidating armed soldiers who surrounded the premises. After giving a grim assessment of Nigeria's military and political predicament, Aguiyi-Ironsi requested the Federal Council of Ministers to resign and cede power to the military. 2 ministers present at the meeting with Aguiyi-Ironsi later admitted that the ministers were too frightened and panicky to say no to Major General JTU Aguiyi-Ironsi, and this amidst the rattle and the whir of military engines in and around the cabinet premises on that awesome night. They voluntarily resigned. Shonekan's resignation 27 years later brought Nigeria full circle. Both incidents involved polite briefings by senior security officers to the civilian leadership, giving the civilians an opportunity to resign and save face. The conspicuous presence of soldiers at both resignations in 1966 and 1993 was meant as a reminder of the alternative scenario if the civilian government refused to resign. A senior officer later revealed that Shonekan was lucky to get off alive. Shonekan's ING suffered death from 1,000 cuts. Although its end was sudden, it had been under siege from its first day. It was detested in the southwest. The public treated it with disdain. Pro-democracy campaigners protested against it. Labor unions refused to work while it was in office. Politicians incited the military to overthrow it. The military shunned and plotted against it, and the National Assembly refused to cooperate with it. It was all too much, and these forces combined to bring the ING tumbling down only after 82 days in office.
Sequel to the resignation of the former head of the Interim National Government and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Chief Ernest Shonekan, and my subsequent appointment as Head of State and Commander-in-Chief, I have had extensive consultations within the Armed Forces hierarchy and other well-meaning Nigerians in a bid to find solutions to the various political, economic, and social problems which have engulfed our beloved country and which have made life most difficult to the ordinary citizens of this nation. Consequently, the following decisions come into immediate effect. The Interim National Government is hereby dissolved. The National and State Assemblies are also dissolved. The State Executive Councils are dissolved. The brigade commanders are to take over from the governors in their states until administrators are appointed. Where there are no brigade commanders, the commissioners of police in the states are to take over. All local governments stand dissolved. The directors of personnel are to take over the administration of the local governments until administrators are appointed. The National Electoral Commission is hereby dissolved. All former secretaries to federal ministries are to hand over to their director generals until ministers are appointed. The 2 political parties are hereby dissolved. All processions, Political meetings and associations of any type in any part of the country are hereby banned. Any consultative committee, by whatever name called, is hereby proscribed. Decree 61 of 1993 is hereby abrogated. A provisional ruling council is hereby established. Drugs trafficking and other economic crimes such as 419 must be tackled and eliminated. On the current strikes throughout the nation, following the increase in the price of fuel, I appeal to all the trade unions to return to work immediately. We cannot afford further dislocation and destruction of our economy. This regime will be firm, humane, and decisive. We will not condone nor tolerate any act of indiscipline. Any attempt to test our will be decisively dealt with. For the international